The thing that landed in Marindal's backyard at 3:14 in the morning was not a meteor. She knew this because meteors don't bleed. She had been awake already. She was always awake at that hour ever since her son died. And she'd seen the streak of it across the low November sky, white hot and wobbling, before it punched through the fence and buried itself in the frozen vegetable garden she hadn't touched since spring. She pulled on her dead husband's coat and her rubber boots and went outside with a flashlight and the wood axe she kept by the back door, because the coast of Jutland had a history of strange things washing ashore, and Marindal had a history of dealing with them herself. It was not a meteor. It was a vehicle of some kind, roughly the size of a transit van, shaped like a seed pod split open along a seam that still glowed orange at the edges. Steam rose from it in the cold air. Fluid. Dark, viscous, smelling of copper and something underneath copper that had no name, dripped from the split seam and pooled in the turned soil. And inside, pinned against a curved interior wall by the impact, was something that was almost a person. Almost. It had 2 arms and a torso and a head of sorts, and it breathed. That was where the resemblance ended. Marin stood at the edge of the crater, with her axe and her flashlight, and looked at it for a long time. Crashed, she said, finally. The thing opened its eyes. They were pale, not white, but the color of water very far down, the color of the Baltic in January. Yes, it said, in a voice like a radio finding its frequency. I crashed. I did not intend to. It paused. I was being shot at. By what? It told her. She stood there, listening, in her dead husband's coat, in the dark, with the frost settling on the broken ground around the pod. And she listened to everything it said. She was 63 years old. She had buried a husband and a child. She had run a fishing concern through 3 recessions, and 2 floods, and 1 year where the fish simply didn't come. She was not the sort of woman who screamed. When it finished, she lowered the axe. How long, she said, do we have? The thing that called itself AL, that was the sound it made, AL, like wind through a cracked window, said, the advanced survey units are already in the upper atmosphere. Psst. They have been there for 11 of your days. When they complete their calibration, the first wave will follow. You have perhaps 6 days. Perhaps 7. And you came to warn us. I came to warn someone. Marin looked at it. At the dark fluid drying in the garden soil, pale deep eyes. Not yet. Then you'll sleep in the barn. There's a cot. My son used to use it. She said it without flinching. She'd had practice. In the morning you'll tell me everything you know about these things. What they want, how they fight, what they're afraid of. Everything. Ale blinked its pale eyes. They are not afraid of anything, it said. They have conquered 11 systems. They have never encountered a species that stopped them. Marin nodded slowly. The way she nodded when her suppliers quoted her prices she had no intention of paying. There's always a first time, she said, and went inside to put the kettle on. She called her granddaughter first, because Sophie was the one she trusted most, and because Sophie was an engineer. Sophie arrived at dawn with her boyfriend Peter, who was a marine biologist and had the specific competence of someone who had spent years thinking about things that lived in places humans weren't meant to go. Marin told them both everything, efficiently, over black coffee and dark bread with butter. Sophie looked at the pod in the garden. She looked at Ale, who was sitting in the barn on the cot with one arm wrapped around its torso and its pale eyes tracking everything. She looked at her grandmother. Okay, she said. Okay, said Marin. Peter said, we need more people. Yes, said Marin. Start calling. It was an extraordinary thing, what happened over the next 4 days. Marindal had lived on that stretch of coast for 63 years. She knew every family within 40 kilometers. She knew who had skills and who had tools and who, when told an impossible thing, would set their jaw and get to work instead of falling apart. She did not call the government. She'd watched enough of what governments did when they panicked, and panic was a resource they could not afford. She called people. Fishermen who knew the water and the tides. Tired demolitions expert who had done 2 tours in Afghanistan and now kept bees. A woman who'd spent 20 years as a trauma surgeon in Copenhagen and had moved north to be quiet, and who received the news with the stillness of someone who had already seen the worst things and kept working through them anyway. 16, her neighbor's son, who said nothing when she told him but went pale and then pink, and then set his jaw the same way his mother did, and said he knew the old NATO radar installations on the headland and could probably get the equipment running if Sophie told him what she needed. His name was Mikkel. He reminded Maren of her son. She didn't say that. Ael watched all of this from the barn and did not understand it. You are organizing, it said to Maren on the third evening. But to what end? Your weapons are ineffective against their hull materials. Your communications infrastructure will be targeted first. You cannot evacuate a significant portion of your population in 6 days. We're not evacuating, Maren said. She was cleaning a coffee pot. She had developed a habit of doing small domestic tasks while having large conversation. It steadied her. Then what? We're making them not want to stay. Ael was quiet for a moment. It processed this. You intend to make occupation costly. I intend to make it impossible. She set the coffee pot down and looked at it directly. They've conquered 11 systems. How? Walk me through the first phase. So it did. And Maren listened. And when she found the shape of the thing, she went and told Sophie and the retired demolitions expert and the trauma surgeon and Mikkel. And together they worked through the night with coffee and graph paper and a great deal of argument. And by morning they had something that was not quite a plan, but was the skeleton of one. And they spent the next 2 days putting meat on the bones. The survey units came down on the 5th day. They were smaller than Maren had expected. Ael had described them as reconnaissance platforms, roughly the size of a delivery drone, but made of a material that absorbed radar and bent light around it, so that they were visible only at certain angles, a shimmer in the air, a wrongness in the peripheral vision. They came in over the water in the early morning, spread across a wide front, systematic and thorough, cataloging, assessing. The retired demolitions expert's name was Bjarn. He had spent 4 days rigging every high point on the headland with a specific combination of equipment that Sophie had designed and that Ael had looked at, pale-eyed and puzzled, and said, I do not know if this will work. Neither do we, Sophie had said. They don't know that. At Bjarn's signal, Mikkel activated the repurposed radar array from the old NATO installation, and Sophie's rigs came online across the headland. Not weapons, not exactly, but coherent electromagnetic interference in the specific frequency range that Ael had identified as the survey unit's communication band. It didn't destroy them. It blinded them. 47 survey units fell silent within 90 seconds, drifting down into the sea, or the scrub like birds stunned by glass. They had 11 minutes before the first wave recalibrated. Now, said Maren, the first wave wasn't what any war movie had ever suggested. It wasn't fire from the sky or an armada darkening the horizon. It was more like weather. A pressure that arrived before the visible part. A subsonic rumble that Maren felt in her chest, and that made the windows flex in their frames. Then the ships came over the water, low and fast, enormous things shaped like nothing, so much as flattened vertebrae, pale gray and absolute, in the way that very large things are absolute, indifferent to the specific scale of a human being, watching from a headland with a bad knee and her dead husband's coat. Maren watched them come. She felt the fear. She had learned, long ago, that feeling the fear and acting despite it were not in conflict. They were the same motion. She keyed her radio. Now, Bjarn. The demolitions expert had once told her that his philosophy of explosives was essentially musical. Timing was everything, and a half-second late was a missed note. And missed notes were how people died. He had spent 4 days timing the charges he'd placed in the underwater rock formations off the southern headland, not to destroy anything, but to create something, a specific pattern of concussive waves through the water, tuned to the resonance frequency of the alien hull material that Ael had scribed, propagated through the shallow coastal shelf in a sequence that looked, on the instruments, like the signature of a planetary defense system beginning to arm. It wasn't. It was Bjarn and 4 days of careful work and 60 years of understanding how sound moves through rock and water. The ships didn't know that. They broke formation. It was the first time, Ael told her later, its pale eyes wide, that they had ever broken formation in a first approach, pulled back, began circling. The circling was, Ael said, diagnostic. They were trying to identify the weapon system that had produced that signature. They will determine it is not what it appears to be, Ale said. It was standing beside Marin now, wrapped in an old oilskin against the wind. Its wounds had closed. It moved carefully, but it moved. When they do, they will adapt and they will come again. I know, said Marin. Now we know they can be surprised. She watched the circling ships. She thought about her son. She thought about Mikkel, 16 years old, at the radar console in the old NATO installation on the headland, his jaw set like his mother's jaw. She thought about all the things humans did when they were frightened and tired, and facing something larger than themselves. They argued, and they improvised, and they called their people, and they made coffee, and they kept working through the night with graph paper and stubbornness until the skeleton became something. They came again on the 6th day and on the 7th, and each time the humans had something new. Not weapons, they never had enough weapons. What they had was what Marin had said from the beginning. They made it costly, not in ships destroyed or soldiers killed, costly in time, in uncertainty, in the specific grinding inefficiency of trying to subdue a population that refused to behave like something being subdued. Ale had told her, in the barn, in those first cold hours, they have never encountered a species that stopped them. It told her something else too, something it had said quietly, almost to itself. Watching Sophie argue with Peter over a diagram at 3 in the morning, while the trauma surgeon slept on the farmhouse couch and Mikkel ate cold porridge over a keyboard. In 11 systems, I have never seen this. What? Marin had said. This particular, it paused, searching for the word. This particular stubbornness. They all fought. But this is different. Marin had thought about that. We're not fighting like we expect to win, she said. We're fighting like we refuse to lose. That's not the same thing. It wasn't, in the end, one battle that stopped them. It was the accumulation. The circling ships that couldn't resolve what they were circling. The survey units that went dark. The communications they couldn't disrupt because the humans routed around the disruptions. Using fishing boat radio nets and hand signals. And a 16-year-old boy who'd memorized contingencies the way his mother had taught him to memorize multiplication tables. The occupied towns that weren't quiet. The endless grinding cost of every hour. On the 19th day, the ships withdrew beyond the atmosphere. They stayed there for 3 days. Then they left. Ale stood in the backyard by the broken fence and watched them go, its breath misting in the cold air. Marin stood beside it. Will they come back? She said. Yes, said Ale, eventually. They are patient and they have resources you cannot comprehend. But, it paused, there are other systems. Systems where the resistance is less costly. Marin nodded. She'd known that. She'd built the whole plan around it. You gave them a problem that wasn't worth solving, Ale said. It sounded like it still wasn't quite sure how to categorize this. We made ourselves inconvenient, Marin said. That's usually enough. She bent down and picked up a piece of the pod's outer hull that had broken off in the impact and ended up near the vegetable bed. She turned it over in her fingers. It was lighter than it looked, and warm, even now. Gardens going to need digging over, she said. All that disturbance to the soil. She looked at the hull fragment. I don't suppose you know anything about growing root vegetables. Ale looked at her. Pale, deep eyes did something she still didn't quite have a word for. Not a smile. Something quieter than a smile. I could learn, it said. Marin set the hull fragment on the fence post. She'd use it as a paperweight. She was practical that way. She went inside to put the kettle on.